There's something I've been saying at the start of every video that seems to have gotten your attention, and you've been very vocal about it. My name is Joe Baur, an American immigrant, Woohoo! Finally some creator that admits he's an American immigrant. Instant like for calling yourself an immigrant instead of expat. Thanks for saying immigrant instead of expat. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And based on recent trends, there are more of us than ever before. So in this video, I'm going to explain why I call myself an American immigrant, what's behind the hate for expat, and why the difference actually matters. But if you're new here, welcome to the channel. My name's Joe Baur. I'm, well, an American immigrant who's been living in Europe for the past decade and traveling around the world even longer, trying to close the gap between the story we're told about a place and what's actually out there. Now let's start at the beginning with the word expat. I honestly don't remember the first time I heard the word expat, but it was probably around the time I moved to Costa Rica 12 years ago for graduate school. Costa Rica is rife with so-called expats, and in many ways I think it's ground zero for how we view expats and the word today in the West. But I'll get back to that. For about a year or so while I was in grad school, I lived in the Central Valley near popular expat havens like Escazú, Santa Ana, and Atenas. They were almost always from the US or Canada without permanent residency in the country. One couple especially sticks out in my memory because they were candid about leaving the country every 3 months to renew their tourist visa, even if it just meant going back and forth through immigration on the same day. And they owned a business, specifically a bed and breakfast, which felt especially strange to not at least get a residency visa, but I digress. All that said, I'm still a youngin' in my 20s at this point. I didn't have any strong feelings about the word expat, nor was I aware that some people detested the word until one of my professors went on a little diatribe about his hatred for the word. He saw expat as a label used exclusively by comparatively wealthy white foreigners who didn't want to be seen as immigrants, a term reserved exclusively for poor people of color. So for a long while, whether it was in Central America or Europe, I was wildly skeptical of people who called themselves expats and the plethora of expat Facebook groups that exist from Central America to Europe. But the longer I lived abroad, I started to see some inconsistencies with the portrayal of the much detested expat and the reality. For starters, I'd be lying if I said I've never met a person of color who called themselves an expat and referenced hanging out in expat communities.
Over the last decade, Black expats have become even more visible, if not more numerous.
But I didn't sense that their intention was malicious or to separate themselves from immigrant communities out of some sort of superiority complex. So then why would someone call themselves an expat instead of an immigrant? I decided it might be useful to go back to the definition itself. Oxford defines the word expat as a person who lives outside their native country. Wow, that's wildly simple for such a controversial word. Clearly there's more to it. According to the 2024 World Migration Report, roughly 300 million people live outside of their birth country. Based on the Oxford definition, all 300 some million of us who live abroad are expats. But depending on who you are and where you come from, people might not peg you as an expat. You might be a refugee, a migrant, or an immigrant. What's helpful is that words like refugee and migrant have more specific definitions. A refugee isn't just someone who lives outside their native country. They're a person who's been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. There's a concrete reason why refugees leave their native country, whereas none is given in the definition of an expat. The same goes for a migrant, a person who moves from one place to another, especially in order to find work or better living conditions. The UN Refugee Agency further differentiates a migrant as someone who leaves their native land by choice. To me, that's key. But so far, nothing obviously nefarious. In fact, an expat sounds an awful like a migrant, but we know that many expats do not see themselves as immigrants or migrants. It seems that because the definition of expat is so broad, people have taken the liberty of giving it a more specific definition. It's kind of an amorphous word turned label we use to differentiate ourselves from other people living outside of their home country. At its least offensive, an expat is just someone living outside of their home country. Maybe a remote worker or someone just bouncing around different countries. At its worst, people see expat as an elitist term reserved for wealthy white travelers who don't want to dirty themselves with labels like immigrant or migrant. Like I said, I've met people from all over the world who've called themselves an expat. So I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. Now I know the internet reacts to nuance like the bees did to Macaulay My Girl Culkin's face, so bear with me. There are 3 key facets that I think make up the modern expat. One is the economic background. From my experiences, what I see as one of the most consistent common denominators of an expat versus an immigrant is the economic background. An expat isn't necessarily wealthy by the standards of their home country, but they can definitely afford to buy a ticket home if an emergency comes up. This definitely isn't the same as, for example, a Pakistani working for some exploitative agency in Dubai that illegally confiscates their passport. In this case, I do think the different labels are helpful, not as a means to say one group is better than the other, but to better monitor things like exploitative employers. If everyone is just a migrant, including comparatively wealthy expats, then it muddies the overall struggles and reality of migrants in a particular country. Countries like the UAE can just flash glossy images of influencers running around the gym with collagen-filled protein smoothies or whatever the f*** and say, "See, migrants are living their best life." Expats have the freedom of choice. Refugees, immigrants, and migrants don't always have that freedom, and I think it's an important distinction. The second key facet of what I think makes up the modern expat, and the one that most obviously separates me from an expat, is the intent. Oxford defines an immigrant as a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country. Now, when I first started dreaming up my move to Europe, to just about anywhere in the continent, my intent was to learn the language and get an EU passport. That's basically the Oxford definition of an immigrant. It's what separates me from an expat, and it's why I didn't call myself an immigrant when I moved to Costa Rica. I knew at the time that my stay in Costa Rica would be temporary. I was a student. Although I did learn decent Spanish and tried to integrate myself into Costa Rican life as much as possible during my relatively short stay by, por ejemplo, writing for the Tico Times, I never intended to permanently settle and become a Costa Rican citizen. But hey, I did write a book about my time in Costa Rica and traveling around Central America called Talking Tico, so if you're interested in that, I'll leave a link in the description below. Germany, though, was a different story. Unlike my move to Costa Rica, I did have that intent to become a citizen and form a permanent bond with the country when I moved to Germany. And that's why I'm an American immigrant, plain and simple. There's one last ingredient that I think plays a significant role in differentiating an immigrant like me from an expat, and that is a country's history of immigration. Last year I was on my friend Yulia's podcast, Going Places. This discussion of being an immigrant came up, and I left the conversation wondering why I didn't consider myself an immigrant in Costa Rica. One aspect was my intent, or lack thereof, to stay permanently. But another factor that I think played a less obvious role is the country's history of immigration. Roughly 10% of Costa Rica's population are immigrants, and they're almost all from their northern neighbor, Nicaragua. There just isn't that history of global immigration to Costa Rica like you'll find in the US or Canada. These are countries that have built part of their national foundation off of the story of immigration. Roughly 15% of the US population are immigrants, but the origins of those immigrants are far more diverse than, say, the immigrants in Costa Rica. Mexico is the largest immigrant population in the United States, accounting for 23% of the total immigrant population in the United States, followed by India, China, and so on. Nearly 38% of New York City's population are immigrants, with linguistic and cultural representation from just about the entire planet. Similarly, 23% of Canada's population are immigrants, with people from India, the Philippines, China, and more. These are both a much closer match to Germany, where 20% of the population are immigrants. Now, the story of immigration to Germany isn't a story told as loudly around the world as the US or even Canada for that matter, but it makes it easier to identify as an immigrant when there are large immigrant communities made up by people who come from the same country as you. In fact, the US recently cracked the top 10 of immigrant nationalities in Berlin. Put more plainly, an immigrant to Costa Rica is very likely to mean one thing: a Nicaraguan working in agriculture. But an immigrant to the US or Canada, or in my case Germany, accounts for everything from taxi drivers to nurses, computer programmers, and doctors from around the world. I think it's easier to find yourself in that kind of diversity and identify with them. This is vastly different from expat communities that, besides being more transient, tend to be nationally homogenous, consisting of primarily, but not exclusively, Anglophones: Brits, Americans, Canadians, and Australians. But to be clear, if you're an American who permanently lives in a country like Costa Rica, you are still an immigrant, even if there aren't many like you. None of this is to say that the label expat can't be or isn't often problematic. I met Canadians and Americans in countries like Costa Rica who've lived there for decades, but still thought of themselves as just expats. If you've lived in a country for a decade plus and are still calling yourself an expat, then something is indeed fishy. And it's why I think Costa Rica is ground zero for expat hatred, at least from a North American perspective. People from the United States first started moving to Costa Rica for retirement in the 1980s, promoted by the Costa Rican government itself. It's still a popular place for Americans to retire for a comparatively lower cost of living with affordable healthcare. Always a holy grail for people from the United States of premiums. Fast forward to today, these communities of financially well-off Norte Americanos and Costa Ricans often live in separate worlds. As a result, expats by and large are not seen as contributing to Costa Rican society. Immigrants, as Lin-Manuel Miranda put it, we get the job done. We actually contribute, but expats are often merely taking advantage of a country like Costa Rica for their own benefit in a way many locals cannot. I'm not saying all expats do this. It's kind of like when women say, not all men, but always a man. Not all expats, but always an expat. All that said, if you're someone who, for whatever reason, bounces around different countries and are living temporarily abroad or have no intention to form permanent bonds with a country other than the one of your birth, then I don't know what else you are but an expat. Maybe digital nomad? But I honestly think that sounds worse and is potentially insulting towards actual nomads who don't have the benefit of sipping hipster coffee between keystrokes on their laptop from the air-conditioned cafe. Speaking of. That's good roast. Let my old millennial ass put it this way. An expat is to a foreign country like a boy is to a woman. They're there for themselves and have no intention to commit. What you really want is an immigrant. We're so ready for commitment, we'll marry you for that passport. Love. We'll marry you for love. Ultimately, I don't want just anyone who lives abroad to call themselves an immigrant. To me, an immigrant is a title earned, much like a doctorate. It takes years of hard work, study, and commitment. It's a title that I'm frankly deeply proud of, and one that I don't think should be given to every dipshit who shows up at airport arrivals with a laptop. But I know this topic brings out wildly strong opinions, so have at it in the comments. Then, check out my last video where I spent a week in Greenland in light of American threats to take over the country. Turns out, they've got bigger problems than the orange elephant in the room.